Now the wind was very violent from the sea and threatened to blow down our tent, which indeed it achieved at last as we made it out a cheerless breakfast. Yet the bosun bade us not to trouble to put it up again, but spread it out with the edges raised upon the props from the reeds, so that we might capture some of the rainwater. For it became imperative that we should renew our supply before setting out to sea again. And whilst some of us were bruised about this, he took the others and set up a small tent made from the spare canvas. And under this he sheltered all of the matters that might be harmed by the rain. And a little, the rain continually very violent. We had near a beaker full of rain collected in the canvas, and were about to run it off into one of the beakers when the bosun cried out for us to hold, and first taste the water before we mixed it with what we already had. At that, we poured down our hands and scooped up some of the water to taste, and thus we discovered it to be brackish and quite undrinkable, at which I was amazed until the bosun reminded us that the canvas had been saturated for many days with salt water, so that it would take a great quantity of fresh water before all the salt was washed out. Then he told us to lay flat on the beach and scour it well on both sides with sand, and we did, and afterwards let the rain rinse it well. Upon the next water we caught, we found to be near fresh, though not for sufficiently for our purpose. Yet, when we rinsed it once more, it became clear as salt, so that we were able to keep it. All that we caught further. And then, something before noon, the rain ceased to fall, through the coming again at odd times and short squalls, yet the wind died not, and blew steadily, and continued so from the quarter and during the remainder of the time that we were upon the inland. Upon the ceasing of the rain, the bosun called us all together. We might make a decent burial of the unfortunate lad, whose remains had lain during the night upon one of the bottom boards of the boat. After a little discussion, it was decided to bury him in the beach, forming a part where there was soft earth in the valley, and none of us had the stomach for that place. Moreover, the sand was soft and easy to dig, and as we had no proper tools, this was a great consideration. Presently, using the bottom oars and a hatchet, we had the place large and deep enough to hold the boy, and so there we placed him. We made no prayer over him, but stood about the grave for a little space, in silence. And the bosun signed for us to fill in the sand, and therewith cover up the poor lad, and left him to his sleep. And presently we made our dinner, after which the bosun served out to each of us sound tot of the rum, for he was minded to bring us back again to a cheerful state of mind. After we had sat a while, smoking, the bosun divided us into two parties to make a search through the island among the rocks. Perchance we find water collected from the rain among the hollows and crevasses, or we had gotten some. Though our device was a sail, yet we had no means caught sufficient for our needs. He was especially anxious for their haste, and that the sun had come out again, for he feared that such a small pools as we would find would be speedily dried up by the heat. The bosun headed one party and set the big seaman over the other, bidding all to keep their weapons very handy. And then he set out to the rocks about the base of the near hill, sending the others to the farther and greater one. And each party we carried an empty breaker slung from a couple of the stout reeds, so that we might be able to pull all such driblets as we should find straight away into it, before they had time to vanish into the hot air. For the purpose of bailing with the water, we had brought with us our tin pankins and one of the boat's bailers. And while, after much scrambling amid the rocks, we came upon a little pool of water that was remarkably sweet and fresh. And from this we removed near 3 gallons before it became dry. And after that, we came across maybe 5 or 6 others, but not one of them near so big as the first. Yet we were not displeased, for we had near 3 parts filled the breaker, and so we made back to camp, having some wonder as to the luck of the other party. When we came near the camp, we found the others returned before us, seeming in very high content with themselves, so that we had no need to call them as to whether they had filled their breaker. When they saw us, they set out to run and tell us they had come up on a great basin of fresh water in a deep hollow 1/3 the distance of the side of the far hill. And at this, the bosun bade us put down our breaker and make a hell of us to the hill, so we might examine for himself whether the news was good as it seemed. Presently, being guided by the other party, we pressed around to look at the back of the far hill, and discovered it go upward to the top at an easy slope, with many ledges and broken places, so that it was scarce more difficult to climb than a stair to climb. And so, having climbed perhaps 90 or 100 feet, we came suddenly upon the place which held the water, and found that they had not made too much of the discovery, for the pool was near 20 feet long by 12 broad, and so clear as it come from the fountain, yet at considerable depth, as we discovered by thrusting a spear shaft down into it. Now, the bosun, having seen himself how good of a supply of water was for our needs, seemed very much relieved in his mind, and declared that within 3 days at most we might leave the island, at which we felt none of us any regret. Indeed, the boat escaped harm. We were able to leave the same day, but this could not be, for there was much to be done before we had her seaworthy again. Having waited until the bosun had made complete his examination, turned to descend, thinking that this would be the bosun's intention, but he called us to stay. And looking back, we saw that he made to finish the ascent of the hill. At that, we hastened to follow him. No, we had no notion of the reason for going higher. Presently, we were come to the top, and we found a very spacious place. Nicely level, save that in one or two parts it was crossed by deepish cracks, maybe half a foot to a foot wide, and perhaps 3 to 6 fathoms long. But apart from these and some great boulders, it was, as I mentioned, a spacious place. Moreover, it was bone dry and pleasantly firm under one's feet after so long upon the sand. I think, even thus early, I had some notion of the bosun's design, for I went to the edge that overlooked the valley and peered down, and finding it a nigh sheer precipice, I found myself nodding my head as though it were in accordance with some part of a formed wish. Presently, looking about me, I discovered the bosun to be serving that part which looked over towards the weed, and I made across to join him. Here, again, I saw that the hill fell in a way very sheer, and after that we went across towards the seaward edge, and there it was, near as abrupt as it was on the weed side. Then, having by this time thought a little further upon the matter, I put it straight to the bosom that we would make indeed a very secure camping place, with nothing to come at us upon our sides or our back, and our front, where there was a slope, could be watched with ease. And this I put to him with great warmth, for I was mortally in dread of the coming night. Now, when I had made end of speaking, the bosun disclosed to me that this was, as I had suspicion, his intent, and immediately he called to the men that we should haste down and ship our camp to the top of the hill. At that, the men expressed their approbation and made haste every one of us to the camp, and began straightway to move our gear to the hilltop. In the meantime, the bosun, taking me to assist him, set again upon the boat, being intent to get his batten nicely shaped and fit to the side of the keel. The line would be bed well to the keel, but particularly into the plank which had sprung outward from its place, and this he labored the greater part of that afternoon, using a little hatchet to shape the wood, which he did with surprising skill. Yet when an evening was come, he had not brought it to his liking, but it must not be thought that he did not but work at the boat, for he had the men to direct, and once he had made his way to the top of the hill to fix the place for a tent, and after the tent was up, he seemed to carry the dry weed to the new camp. And at this, he kept them until near dusk, for he had vowed never again to be without a sufficiency of fuel. But two of the men he sent to collect shellfish, putting two of them to the task, but he would not have one alone upon the island, not knowing but that there might be danger, even though it were a bright day, and a most happy ruling it proved. For a little past the middle of the afternoon, we heard them shouting at the other Indian valley, and not knowing that they were in need of assistance, we ran with all haste to discover the reason upon their calling, passing along the right-hand side of the blackened and sodden vale. Upon reaching the further beach, where we saw the most incredible gift. For the two men running towards us through the thick masses of the weed, well no more than 4 or 5 fathoms behind them, they pursued by an enormous crab, now a head of the crab we had tried to capture before the coming into the island, a prodigy, unsurpassed. But this creature was more than treble its size, seeming as though prodigious stable were a chase of them, and moreover, spite its monstrous bulk, it made better way of the weed than I should conceive to be possible, running almost sideways, and with one enormous claw risen near 12 feet into the air. Now, whether omitting accidents, the men would have made good their escape to the firmer ground of the valley, where they could have attained to a greater speed, I do not know. But suddenly one of them tripped over a loop of the weed, and the next instant lay helpless upon his face. He had been dead the following moment, but for the pluck of his companion, who faced round manfully upon the monster, and had ran at it with his 20-foot spear. It seemed to me that the spear took about a foot below the overhanging armor of the great back shell, and I could see that it penetrated some distance into the creature, the man having by aid of Providence stricken it in a vulnerable part. Upon receiving his thrust, the mighty crab ceased at his pursuit, and clipped at the haft of the spear with its great mandible, snubbing the weapon more easily than done the same thing to a straw. By the time we had raced up to the men, one who had stumbled was again upon his feet, turning to assist his comrade. But the bosun snatched his spear from him and leapt forward himself, for the crab was making now at the other men. Now the bosun did not attempt to thrust a spear into the monster, but he made 2 swift blows at the protruding eyes, and in the moment the creature had girdled itself up helpless, save that the huge claw waved about aimlessly. At that, the bosun drew us off, though the man who had attacked the crab desired to make an end of it, averring that we should have very good eating out of it. But of this the bosun would not listen, telling him he was yet capable of very deadly mischief. Did any but come within reach of his prodigious mandible. And after this he bade them to look no more selfish, but take out the 2 fishing lines which we had, and see if we could catch aught, some safe ledge on the other side of the hill which we made our camp. And then he returned to the mending of the boat. It was a little before the evening came upon the island that he bosun ceased to work, and after that he called the men who had made end of the fuel carrying were standing near to place the full beakers, which we had not thought needful to carry to the new camp on account of the weight, under the upturned boat, some holding up the gunwale whilst the others pushed them under. The boatswain laid the unfinished batten along with them, and we lowered the boat again over the tall, trusting its weight to prevent any creature from meddling with aught. After that, we made at once to the camp, being wearifully tired with hearty anticipation of supper. Upon reaching the hilltop, the men who the boatswain sent with the lines came to show a very fine fish, something like a huge kingfish, which they had caught a few minutes earlier. This the boatswain, after examining, did not hesitate to pronounce fit for food, whereupon they set to open and clean it. Now I have said, it was not unlike a great kingfish, and like it had a mouthful of formidable teeth, the use of which I understood the better when I saw the contents of its stomach, which seemed to consist of nothing but the coiled tentacles of squid or cuttlefish, with which I had shown the weed continents swarmed. When these were upset upon the rock, I was confounded to perceive the length and thickness of some of them, and could only see that the particular fish must have been very desperate enemy to them, and was successful to attack the monsters of a bulk infinity greater than its own. After this, once the supper was preparing, the boatswain called to some of the men to put up a piece of the spare canvas upon a couple of the reeds, so to make a screen against the wind, which was so fresh that it came near times to scattering the fire abroad. This they found not difficult, for a little on the windward side of the fire ran one of the cracks which I had made provision mention, as they jammed the supports, and in so very little time had the fire screened. Presently the supper was ready, and I found the fish to be very fair eating, though somewhat coarse. But this was no greater matter for concern, with so empty a stomach as I contained. And here I would remark that we made our fishing save our provisions, though we're to all stay on the island. Then, after we come to the near end of our eating, we lay down to a most comfortable smoke, for we had no fear at the time of the attack. And that height, and with the precipice upon all sides, faint and that lay in front. Yet so soon we had rested and smoked a while, the boatswain set the watches, for he would run no risk through carelessness. By the time the night was drawing on apace, yet it was not so dark that one could not perceive the matters at a very reasonable distance. Being in a mood that tended to thoughtfulness, the feeling, a desire to be alone for a little, I strolled away from the fire to the leeward edge of the hilltop. Here I paced up and down a little while, smoking and meditating, and I would stare across the immensity of the vast continent of weed and slime that stretched its incredible desolation out beyond the darkening horizon. And there would come the thought to me, the terror of men whose vessels have been entangled among the strange growths. And so my thoughts came to the lone derelict that lay out there in the dusk, and I fell to wondering what had been the end of her people, and at that I grew yet more solemn in my heart. For it seemed to me they must have died, last by starvation, and if not by that, then by the act of some of the devil creatures which inhabited the lonely weed world. And then, even as I fell upon this thought, the bosun clapped me on the shoulder and told me in a very hearty way to come to the light of the fire and banish all melancholy thoughts. For he had been a very penetrating discernment and had followed me quietly from the camping place, having a reason once or twice before tried me for gloomy meditations. And for this, and many other matters, I had grown to like the man, the which I could almost believe at times was his regarding of me. But his words were too few for me to gather his feelings, though I had hoped that they were as I surmised. And so I came back to the fire, and presently, not being my time to watch until after midnight, I turned to the tent for a spell of sleep. Having first arranged a comfortable spread of some of the softer portions of the dry weed to make a bed. Now I was full asleep, so that I slept heavily, and in this wise heard not the man on watch that called the bosun, yet rousing of the others, waked me. And so I came to myself and found the tent empty, at which I ran early to the doorway and discovered that there was a clear moon in the sky, which, by the reason of the cloudlessness that had prevailed, we had been without for the past 2 nights. Moreover, the sultriness had gone, the wind having blown away the clouds. Yet though maybe I appreciated this, but in a half-conscious manner, for I was put about to discover the whereabouts of the men, and the reason of their leaving the tent. With this purpose, I stepped out of the entrance. In this instant, I discovered them all in a column beside the leeward edge of the hilltop, and that I held my tongue, for I knew not what silence might be their desire. But I ran hastily over to them and inquired of the bosun what the manner of the thing which called them from their sleep. And he, for answered, pointed out the greatness of the weed continent. At that, I stared out over the breadth of the weed, showing very closely in the moonlight, but for the moment I saw not a thing to which he purposed to draw my attention, and then suddenly it fell within the circles of my gaze. I stared with bewildered eyes. Then it came to me with abruptness that the light shone from the lone derrick laying out in the weed. The same that upon that very evening I had looked with the sorrow and awe, because at the end of those who had been in her. And now, behold, a light burning, seemingly within one of her after cabins, though the moon was scarce powerful enough to enable the outline of the hulk to be seen clear of the rounding wilderness. And from this time until the day, we had no more sleep, but made up the fire and sat around it, full of excitement and wonder, and getting up continually to discover the light still burned. This ceased to do about an hour after I had seen it, but there was more proof that some of our kind were no mere than half a mile from the camp. And at last, the day came. The signals from the ship. Now soon after it was clearly light, we went all of us to the leeward brow of the hill to stare upon the derelict, which now we had cause to believe no derelict but an inhabited vessel. Yet though we watched her for upwards of 2 hours, we could discover no sign of any living creature, the which, indeed, we had in cooler minds. We had not thought strange, seeing that she was all shut in by the great superstructure, but they were not hot to see a fellow creature. After so much lonesomeness and terror in strange land and seas, and so could not by any means contain ourselves in patience until those aboard the hulk should choose to discover themselves to us. And so, at last, being wearied with watching, we made it up together to shout when the boatswain should give us the signal, and by this means making a good volume of sound which we conceived the wind might carry down to the vessel. Yet though we raised many shouts, making it seem to us a very great noise, there came no response from the ship. And at last, we were fain to cease from our calling, and ponder about some other way of bringing ourselves to the notice of those within the hulk. For a while, we talked about proposing one thing and some another, but none of them seeming to achieve our purpose. And after that we fell to marveling that the fire which we had lit in the valley had not awakened them to the fact that some of their fellow creatures were upon this island. Or had it, we could not suppose that they would have kept a perpetual watch upon the island till some time as they should be able to see attract our notice. Nay, more than this, it was scarce credible that they should not have made an answering fire, or set some of the bunting above the superstructure, so that our gaze should rest upon them the instant we had chanced to glance towards the hulk. But so far from this, there appeared even a purpose to shun our attention, for that light which we viewed in the past night was more in the way of an accident than of the nature for a purposeful expedition. And so, presently we went to breakfast, eating heartily, our night of wakefulness have given us mighty appetites. But for all that, we were so engrossed by the mystery of the lonesome craft that I doubt if any of us knew what manner of food is which we filled our bellies. For the first one view of the matter would be raised, And when this had been combated, another would be broached, and this wise came up to finally that something of the men were falling in doubt whether the ship was inhabited by anything human. Saying rather that it might be held by some domestic creature of the great wheat continent. At this position, there came among us a very uncomfortable silence. For it did not only did it chill the warmth of our hopes, but it seemed like to provide us with a fresh terror, who were already acquainted with too much. Then the boatswain spoke, laughing with a hearty contempt at our sudden fears, and pointed out that it was just like that they aboard the ship had been put fear by the great blaze from the valley, as they should take it as a sign of fellow creatures and friends were at hand. For as he put it to us, who of us could say what fell brutes and demons the weed cotton did hold? And we had reason to know that there are very dread things among the weed. How much more must they, who had, for all that we knew, been many years beset by such? And so as he went to make it clear, we might suppose that they very well aware there had come some creatures to the island, yet maybe they desired not to make themselves known until they had given sight of them. Because of this, we must wait until they choose to discover themselves to us. Now when the boatswain had made end, we felt each one of us greatly cheered, for his discourse seemed very reasonable. Yet still there were many matters that troubled our company. For, as one put it, was it not mightily strange that we had not at provision sight of the light, or in the day of smoke from the gallery fire? But to this boatswain replied our camp hitherto had lain in a place where we had not the sight, even of the great world of weed, leaving alone any view of the derelict. And more, at such times as we had crossed the opposite beach, we had been too occupied so sincerely to have much thought to watch the bulk, which indeed, from that position showed only her great superstructure. Further, that, until the preceding day, we had once climbed to any height that from our present camp the derelict could not be viewed, and to do so, we had to go near the leeward edge of the hilltop. And so, after breakfast being ended, we went all of us to see if there were yet any signs of life in the hulk. But when 1 hour had gone, we were no wiser, and therefore, it being folly to waste further time, the boatswain left one man to watch from the brow of the hill, charging him very strictly to keep watch in such position as he could be seen by any aboard the silent craft, and so took the rest down to assist him in the repairing of the boat. And from thence, on during the day, he gave a man a turn each at watching, telling him to wave to him should there be any sign from the hulk. Yet expecting the watch, he kept every man so busy as he might be, some bringing weed to keep the fire which had lit near the boat, one to help him turn the whole of the batten upon which he labored, and two he sent across the wreck of the mast to detach one of the forelock shrouds, which, as it's most rare, were made of iron rods. This, when they brought it, he had bade me heat in the fire, and afterwards beat out straight at one end. And when this was done, he set me to burn holes with it through the keel of the boat, at such places he had marked, for these being the bolts which he had determined to fasten on the batten. In the meanwhile, he continued to shape the batten until it was a very good and true fit according to his liking. And while he cried out to this man and to that one to do this or that, and so I perceived that what from the necessity of getting a boat into a seaworthy condition, he was desirous to keep the men busy, for they were to become so excited that fought the fellow creatures almost within hail, that he cannot hope to keep them sufficiently in hand with some matter upon which they employ them. Now, it must not be supposed that the bosom had no share of our excitement, for I noticed that he gave ever and anon a glance to the crown of the far hill. Perchance the watchman had some news for us. Yet the morning went by, and no signal came to tell us that the people in the ship had designed to show themselves to the man upon the watch. And so we came to dinner, and this meal, as we might be supposed, we had a second discussion upon the strangeness of the behavior of those aboard the hulk. Yet none could give any more reasonable explanation than the boatswain had given in the morning, so we left it at that. Presently, when we had smoked and rested very comfortably, for the boatswain was no tyrant. We rose at his bidding to descend once more near the beach. But at this moment, one of the men, having run to the edge of the hill to take a short look at the hulk, cried out that part of the great superstructure over the quarter had been removed or pushed back, and that there was a figure there, seeming, so far as his unaided sight could tell, to be looking through a spyglass at the island. Now it would be difficult to tell of all excitement at this news, and we ran eagerly to see ourselves if it could be as formed as us. And so it was, for we could see the person very clearly, through the mote and small because of the distance that he had seen us. We discovered in a moment, for he suddenly to wave something which I judged to be the spyglass, in a very wild manner, seeming also to be jumping up and down. Yet I doubt not but that we were so much as excited, for I suddenly discovered myself to be shouting with the rest in a most insane fashion. Moreover, I was waving my hands and running to and fro upon the brow of the hill. Then I observed that the figure on the hulk had disappeared, but it was for no more than a moment. And then it was back in there, near a dozen with it, and it seemed to me that some of them were females, but the distance was over great for surety. Now all these, all of them seeing us upon the brow of the hill, where we must have shown up in plain against the sky, we began at once to wave in a very frantic way, and we replying in like manner, shouted ourselves hoarse with vain greetings. But soon we grew wearied of this unsatisfactoriness, on this method of showing our excitement, and one took a piece of the square canvas and let it stream out into the wind, waving it to them, and another took up second piece and did likewise, while third man rolled up a short bit into a cone, and made use of it as a speaking trumpet, though I doubt as if his voice was carried any further because of it. For my part, I seized one of those long bamboo-like reeds, which were laying about near the fire, and with this, making a very show. And so it seemed how very great and ingenious was our exhalation upon our discovery of these poor people, shut off from the world within that loathsome craft. And then suddenly, it come to us to realize that they were among the weed, and we upon the hilltop, and that we had no means of bridging which lay between. And at this we faced another to discuss what we should do to effect the rescue of those within the hulk. Yet it was little that we could even suggest, for though one spoke of how he had seen a rope cast by means of motor to the ship that lay offshore, yet this helped us not, for we had no mortar. But here the very same man cried out that they in the ship might have such a thing, so that would be able to shoot to us the rope. And at this we thought a little more upon his saying, for if they had such a weapon, they might have difficulties be solved. Yet we were greatly at a loss not to know how we should discover whether they were possessed of one, and to further explain our design to them. But here the boatswain came to our help, and bade one man to go quickly and charge some of the reeds in the fire. Whilst this was doing, he sped out upon one of the rocks the spare lengths of canvas, and he sung out to the man to bring him one of the pieces of the charcoal reed. And with this he wrote our question upon the canvas, calling for fresh charcoal as he required it. And then, having made an end of the writing, he bade two of the men take hold of the canvas by the ends and expose it to the view of those in the ship. And in a manner we got them to understand our desires, for presently some of them went away and came back after a little and held up for us to see a very great square of white, and upon it a great no. And at this we were again at our wits' ends to know how it would be possible to rescue those within the ship. For suddenly our whole desire to leave the island was changed in determination to rescue the people in the hulk. Indeed, had our intentions not been such that we had veritable curs, though I am happy to tell that we had not thought of this juncture, but for those who were now looking for us to restore them once more to the world to which they had been so long strangers. Now, as I said, we were again at our wits' ends to know how to come at those within the hulk. We stood all of us, only that in his case, his sweetheart hauling up the rope by means of the cord. Now it seemed to me a possible thing to substitute a bow for the mortar, and in this view I took up one of the lengths, for which I found to be very good. For this curious growth of which I have spoken hitherto as a reed, had no resemblance to that plant, beyond its appearance, it being extraordinarily tough and woody and having considerably more nature than a bamboo. Now, having tried the spring of it, I went over to the tent to cut a piece of the sarsaparilla, which I found among the ear, and with this at the reed I could drive the rough bow. Then I looked about until I came upon a very young and slender reed, which had been cut with the rest, and from this I fashioned some sort of an arrow, feathering it with a piece of one of the broad, stiff leaves which grew upon the plant, and after that I went forth to the crowd, and did a jest, and some of them laughed, conceiving that this was very action on my part. But when I explained that which was in my mind, they ceased from laughter, and shook their heads, making that I did but waste for time. As they said, nothing save gunpowder could ever cover so great a distance. Gunpowder could ever cover so great a distance. And after that they turned again to the bosom, for I held my peace and listened. Thus I discovered that certain of the men advocated for taking the boat so soon as it was sufficiently repaired, and making passage through the weed to the ship, which were proposed to do by cutting a narrow channel. But the boatswain shook his head and reminded them of the great devilfish and the crabs, and the worst things which a weed concealed, saying that those in the ship would have done long since have been possible, and that the men were silenced, being rings. Now, just at this point, there happened a thing which proved the wisdom of which the boatswain contended for. For suddenly one of the men cried out for us to look, and as we turned, we saw that there was a great commotion among those who were in the open place of the superstructure, for they were running this way and that, and some were pushing. And then, immediately we saw the reason for their agitation, and near the haze there was a stir in the weed near the stem of the ship, and in the next instant, a monstrous tentacle reached up the place where there had been the opening, but the door was shut, and those aboard in the hulk in safety. At this manifestation, the men about me I proposed to make use of the boat, and the others also cried out in the horror of the vast creature. And I am convinced, had the rescue depended upon use of the boat, then Now, conceiving this was a good point at which to renew my plan, renew my opportunities, I began once again of the probabilities of our plan succeeding, addressing myself more practically, particularly to the bosun. I told how that I had read that the ancients made mighty weapons, so much that they could throw a great stone too, so heavy as passing a quarter of a mile. Moreover, that they compass huge catapults which threw a lance or a great arrow even further. On this, he expressed much surprise, never heard of the like, but doubted greatly that we should be able to construct such a weapon. Yet I told him I was prepared, for I had a plan on one clearly in mind, and further I pointed out to him that we had bait tied up, which would allow the arrow to travel further before it came so low as the weed. Then I stepped to the edge of the hill, and bidding him watch as I fitted my arrow to the string, and having bent the bow loosed it, whereupon, being aided by the wind and the height on which I stood, the arrow plunged into the weed at a distance nearly 200 yards from where we stood, and that being but a quarter of the distance of the road to the derelict. At that, the bosun was won over by my idea. As he remarked, the arrow followed near that had been drawing a length of yarn after it. At this I assented, but pointed out that my bow and arrow was but a rough affair, and more, that I was no archer. Yet I promised him with the bow that I could make, to cast the shaft clean over the bulk. But he did not give me his assistance, and bid the men to help. Now I have come to regard it in the light of my greater knowledge. My promise was exceeding rash, but I had faith in my conception, and was very eager to put it to test, the which was after much discussion at supper. It was decided I should be allowed to do so.